The morning fog had not yet lifted from the Norman countryside when Obergefreiter Klaus Müller first understood that Germany had already lost the war. He sat in a partially collapsed barn near Sainte-Mère-Église on the 7th day of June, 1944, keeping watch through a gap in the weathered boards. What he witnessed in those early hours would haunt him for the rest of his life, not because of its violence, but because of its implications. From his concealed position, Müller watched an unbroken column of American military vehicles stream inland from the beaches. They moved with mechanical precision, each one identical to the last, their olive-drab paint still fresh, their engines running with the smooth confidence of factory-new machinery. He began counting at dawn, scratching marks into the wooden beam beside him with his bayonet. By the time the sun had climbed high enough to burn away the coastal mist, he had marked 117 identical reconnaissance vehicles. These machines, which the Americans called jeeps, represented something far more terrifying than tanks or artillery. They were the physical manifestation of an industrial capacity so vast that it rendered traditional military calculations meaningless. Müller had been a soldier for 5 years. He had fought in Poland, where cavalry charges had broken against machine gun positions. He had survived France, where the Wehrmacht's tactical brilliance had shattered Allied defences in weeks. He had endured 2 winters in Russia, where men froze to death clutching rifles that no longer fired. Through all of this, he had maintained faith in German military superiority, in the professional excellence of the Wehrmacht, in the technological advancement of German engineering. Now, watching this endless procession of simple, crude, mass-produced vehicles, he realized that none of it mattered. Germany was not fighting an army. It was fighting an entire industrial civilization that had learned to manufacture war itself. The vehicles continued past his position throughout the morning, each one carrying 4 men and their equipment, each one moving with the same steady pace, each one appearing as if it had just rolled off an assembly line moments before. Which, in many cases, it had. The Atlantic crossing that should have damaged these machines, exposed them to salt spray and rough handling, seemed to have left no mark. Every vehicle bore the same configuration, the same load of supplies, the same purposeful efficiency. Müller knew vehicles. Before the war, he had worked in his father's garage in Stuttgart, repairing automobiles and trucks for local businesses. He understood machinery, respected it, knew the care and maintenance required to keep complex equipment functioning. What he was witnessing violated every principle of mechanical logistics he had learned. These vehicles should not exist in such numbers. They should not be distributed so lavishly to an invading force. They should not be treated with such apparent casualness. The landing ships that had delivered these vehicles to the Norman coast represented another impossibility. Each LST could carry 30 fully assembled jeeps, along with fuel, spare parts, and the personnel to operate them. Hundreds of these ships had crossed the English Channel in the past few days, and more were arriving with every tide. The mathematics was devastating. If each ship carried 30 jeeps, and hundreds of ships had landed, then thousands of these vehicles were already on French soil. And this was just the beginning. The Americans were not establishing a beachhead. They were constructing an industrial presence, a mobile factory of warfare that could be sustained indefinitely. Müller had seen German units fight desperately for a single truck, watched mechanics work through the night to keep one vehicle operational, witnessed officers court-martialed for losing equipment through negligence. The contrast was absolute and demoralizing. Hauptmann Werner Lindemann commanded the 3rd Company of the 919th Grenadier Regiment from a hastily prepared position 3 kilometers inland from the coast. His men had been fighting since the early hours of June 6th, and in those 2 days he had developed a profound respect for American material abundance that bordered on despair. On the morning of June 9th, he sat in a captured farmhouse and composed his after-action report with hands that still trembled from exhaustion and accumulated stress. "The enemy," he wrote carefully, "possesses vehicles in quantities we have reserved for ammunition rounds." This was not hyperbole or defeatist exaggeration. It was a precise military assessment based on direct observation. Every American unit, down to the squad level, appeared to have motorized transport available. Yesterday, his men had achieved what they considered a significant tactical success, destroying 12 American reconnaissance vehicles through careful ambush and accurate anti-tank fire. This morning, looking across the same sector through his field glasses, he had counted 40 fresh vehicles operating in the area his men had so recently cleared. The Americans treated complex military vehicles the way the Wehrmacht treated rifle cartridges, as consumable items to be used and discarded without concern for conservation or careful preservation. In the German military tradition, each vehicle was a valuable asset to be carefully tracked throughout its service life, maintained with precision, and preserved at all costs. Losing a vehicle required written reports, investigation of circumstances, and often resulted in disciplinary action. The American approach seemed to be the opposite of everything Lindemann had been trained to expect. They used vehicles until they broke, then simply obtained replacements from an apparently inexhaustible supply. The psychological impact on his men was becoming a problem. Soldiers who had been told that the enemy was soft, dependent on luxury, and lacking in martial spirit were confronting an opponent who possessed material abundance beyond their comprehension. Had Lindemann known the actual statistics of American Jeep production, his despair would have been even more profound. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories would produce over 640,000 of these vehicles. At peak production efficiency, Willys Overland Motor Company of Toledo, Ohio, and Ford Motor Company of Dearborn, Michigan, were completing one vehicle every 90 seconds on their assembly lines. This single vehicle type represented 1/4 of all American military motor transport production during the war. The Germans, struggling with material shortages and bombed factories, had managed to produce barely 50,000 Kübelwagens during the entire conflict. The scale of the disparity made meaningful comparison almost impossible. One American factory, operating for 1 month, could produce more vehicles than the entire German automotive industry could manufacture in 6 months of maximum effort. What made this production miracle possible was a level of standardization that exceeded anything in German military experience. Every Jeep, whether built by Willys or Ford, used completely interchangeable parts. A transmission removed from a destroyed Ford GPW could be installed in a Willys MB in minutes without modification or adjustment. Wheels, engines, axles, electrical components, even minor items like spark plugs, fan belts, and oil filters were identical across all production runs and both manufacturers. This standardization extended throughout the entire supply system. Spare parts were pre-positioned at supply dumps based on statistical analysis of historical failure rates, ensuring that replacement components were always available where and when they would be needed. The system operated with mechanical efficiency, anticipating needs before they arose, delivering solutions before problems became critical. Feldwebel Hans Richter of the 716th Static Infantry Division had established an observation post in a ruined church tower near Carentan, and from this elevated position he maintained a detailed diary of American operations. His entries provide a unique window into German bewilderment at American logistics. On June 10th, he recorded an incident that crystallized his understanding of the enemy's approach to warfare. He had been observing an American maintenance area through his field glasses when a damaged Jeep was towed in by another vehicle. The damaged machine had suffered what appeared to be significant mechanical failure, possibly a thrown rod or cracked engine block. Richter expected to witness the careful diagnostic work, the precise measurement and adjustment that German mechanics would employ in such a situation. Instead, he watched in amazement as American soldiers simply unbolted the damaged engine and lifted it out of the vehicle using a portable hoist. The entire power plant, a complex assembly of metal components that represented hundreds of hours of precision manufacturing, was set aside as if it were a worn-out tire. A replacement engine, still in its factory packaging, was then installed in the empty engine bay. The entire operation took less than an hour. The Americans did not repair their vehicles, Richter wrote that evening. They simply replaced broken parts with new ones from an endless supply. I watched them restore a damaged vehicle to full operation while under sporadic artillery fire, while smoking cigarettes, while joking with each other as if they were working in a peacetime garage rather than a combat zone. Our mechanics would require a week to perform such an operation, and would need to do so in a proper workshop with specialized tools and equipment. The Americans did it in a muddy field, using hand tools, treating the complex machinery as if it were disposable. This is not warfare as we understand it. This is industrial production extended to the battlefield itself. The German military mind, shaped by centuries of European military tradition and refined through decades of professional military education, struggled to comprehend the American approach to equipment management. In the Wehrmacht, every piece of equipment was carefully inventoried and tracked throughout its service life. Vehicles were assigned to specific units and their movements recorded in detailed logs. Commanding officers were personally responsible for the equipment under their command, and any loss had to be justified through written reports that moved up the chain of command. Mechanical problems were diagnosed with methodical precision, components were carefully repaired when possible, and parts were manufactured by unit workshops when replacements were unavailable from the central supply system. The Kübelwagen, Germany's closest equivalent to the American Jeep, required factory-trained mechanics for any significant maintenance work. Its air-cooled engine was sophisticated and temperamental. Its suspension required careful adjustment. Its electrical system demanded expertise to troubleshoot and repair. The Americans operated on entirely different principles that reflected their industrial culture rather than military tradition. They had calculated that a Jeep's combat life expectancy was 90 days under normal operational conditions. Rather than investing in elaborate repair facilities and diagnostic procedures, they simply manufactured replacement vehicles in quantities that exceeded any possible loss rate, even accounting for combat damage and mechanical failure. When a Jeep was damaged beyond immediate field repair, it was stripped of any usable components and then abandoned. The practice of cannibalizing damaged vehicles for spare parts was standard procedure. A replacement vehicle would arrive within hours, or at most a few days, delivered by the endless supply convoys that connected the beaches to the advancing front lines. The abandoned hulks that littered the Norman countryside bore witness to this approach. German soldiers would examine these wrecks, removing parts for their own desperate maintenance needs, amazed that the Americans would discard such valuable machinery. Lieutenant Colonel Otto von Schroeder served as Chief of Staff of the 352nd Infantry Division, one of the units that had borne the initial shock of the invasion. He was a professional officer of the old school, educated at the War Academy, experienced in both world wars, and thoroughly versed in military logistics and operational planning. What he witnessed in Normandy challenged every principle of military economy he had learned. On June 12th, he wrote a letter to his wife, knowing that it would be read by military censors but feeling compelled to express his thoughts to someone. "The Americans fight a rich man's war," he wrote. "They expend vehicles the way we expend ammunition, casually and without apparent concern for conservation. Yesterday, I personally observed a Jeep strike a mine on a road we had seeded 3 days earlier. The explosion destroyed the front axle and damaged the engine. The crew, all unhurt, simply transferred their equipment and weapons to another Jeep that appeared within minutes, as if it had been waiting nearby specifically for this purpose. They then continued their mission without pause. The destroyed vehicle was pushed to the roadside and abandoned. In our army, such a loss would require multiple reports, investigations into whether proper precautions had been taken, and weeks or even months of effort to obtain a replacement. The Americans simply discarded the broken machine and continued operating as if nothing had happened. By June 10th, American forces had successfully landed over 12,000 vehicles of all types in Normandy, with Jeeps comprising the single largest category. These vehicles transformed the battlefield in ways that German tactical doctrine had not anticipated and could not counter. American reconnaissance units penetrated German defensive positions with unprecedented speed and flexibility, exploiting gaps that would have been impractical for foot-mounted patrols to utilize. Artillery forward observers mounted in jeeps equipped with radio sets could rapidly relocate after calling fire missions, making German counter-battery fire nearly impossible. The standard German response to artillery attack was to trace the trajectory of incoming rounds, calculate the firing position, and direct counter-battery fire against the enemy guns. This worked well against static artillery positions, but American forward observers would call in fire missions and then immediately displace to new positions, often several kilometers away, before German counterfire could be organized. Supply units maintained continuous contact with advancing combat forces, eliminating the traditional pauses for consolidation and resupply that German commanders had expected to exploit for counterattacks and defensive preparation. The Jeep's mechanical capabilities compounded German defensive difficulties. With its four-wheel drive system and relatively low weight, the vehicle could traverse terrain that German planners had considered impassable for motorized forces. The Norman bocage country, with its ancient field boundaries marked by earthen banks topped with thick hedgerows, should have channeled American vehicle movement into predictable routes that German forces could defend effectively. Traditional military wisdom held that vehicle-dependent forces would be restricted to roads and obvious avenues of approach, making them vulnerable to ambush and prepared defensive positions. Instead, American jeeps simply drove through fields, over embankments, around obstacles, creating their own road network independent of the mapped routes that German forces had prepared to defend. Commanders who had carefully positioned anti-tank guns to cover road junctions found their weapons useless as American vehicles bypassed their positions entirely, moving through areas the German maps indicated were impassable. Oberst Hans von Luck commanded a battle group of the 21st Panzer Division, one of the more mobile and well-equipped German formations in Normandy. His post-war memoir provides valuable insight into German tactical frustration. "The Jeep," he wrote, "gave every American unit the mobility that we had achieved only with our elite mechanized forces. A single vehicle could transport a machine gun team with weapon and ammunition, a mortar crew with their weapon and rounds, communications equipment and operators, or supplies and equipment. They appeared everywhere, in places we considered secure, bringing firepower or calling in devastating artillery strikes with their radio sets. We attempted to establish continuous defensive lines, but the Americans simply drove around our positions, infiltrating through gaps we did not know existed, appearing behind our lines and creating chaos in our rear areas." The traditional concept of a stable front line became meaningless when the enemy possessed such universal mobility. The maintenance and supply system supporting these thousands of vehicles proved equally overwhelming to German observers. American logistics units had prepared for sustained operations on an industrial scale that dwarfed anything in German experience. Liberty ships and other cargo vessels arrived daily at the Norman beaches, carrying not just fuel and ammunition, but entire vehicles still in their factory wrapping, spare engines packed in protective crates, transmissions ready for installation, and pre-packaged component sets designed for specific repairs. Mobile workshops, themselves mounted on trucks and equipped with power tools, spare parts, and trained mechanics, advanced immediately behind combat units. These maintenance sections were capable of performing any conceivable repair or replacement operation under field conditions. If a combat unit reported the loss of 10 jeeps through enemy action or mechanical failure, 10 replacement vehicles would arrive within 48 hours, often less. The vehicles would be fully fueled, equipped with complete toolkits, loaded with spare parts, and ready for immediate operation. Major Heinrich Zimmermann of the 12th SS Panzer Division had fought on the Eastern Front before being transferred to France, and he brought that experience to his assessment of American logistics. The American supply system, he observed in a report to his divisional commander, operates like a factory production line that has been extended directly to the battlefield itself. Everything is standardized according to predetermined specifications, packaged for efficient transport and handling, and delivered on predictable schedules. They have effectively removed the friction from warfare that Clausewitz described as fundamental to military operations. While we struggle desperately to maintain our existing equipment with improvised repairs and hand-manufactured replacement parts, they simply order replacements as if shopping from a commercial catalogue. Our supply system is based on scarcity and conservation. Theirs is based on abundance and replacement. We cannot compete on these terms. The psychological impact on German forces manifested within days of the invasion and deepened as the campaign progressed. Soldiers who had been indoctrinated with propaganda about American softness, dependency on material comfort, and lack of fighting spirit discovered an enemy who possessed material abundance that seemed almost supernatural in its extent. The sight of endless columns of identical jeeps, each one appearing factory new and fully equipped, profoundly demoralized troops who were carefully preserving vehicles that had been in continuous service since the Polish campaign of 1939. Some German vehicles in Normandy bore battle damage from multiple campaigns, repaired in field workshops and kept running through the skill and dedication of mechanics who worked miracles with limited resources. The American vehicles showed no signs of age or wear because they had no age or wear. They were fresh from the factory, delivered across the Atlantic Ocean in quantities that seemed to mock German industrial capacity. Gefreiter Wolfgang Braun served as a mechanic with the 21st Panzer Division, and his technical training gave him unique insight into captured American equipment. On June 15th, his unit overran a small American supply dump and captured 3 intact jeeps along with a substantial quantity of spare parts. Braun spent several hours examining these vehicles with professional interest, and his subsequent report to his commanding officer revealed both admiration and frustration. Every component, he wrote, is clearly designed for mass production and ease of replacement rather than longevity or refinement. The engine is simple in design, but entirely adequate for its purpose, delivering reliable power without sophistication. The transmission is robust rather than refined, built to withstand abuse rather than provide smooth gear changes. The suspension is crude but effective, using simple leaf springs rather than the more advanced torsion bar systems we employ. Nothing is polished to a fine finish or precisely fitted beyond functional requirements, yet everything functions reliably under operational conditions. They have deliberately sacrificed elegance and engineering excellence for the sake of quantity and ease of production, and in the context of this war, quantity is proving more valuable than quality. The racial integration visible in American motor pools particularly troubled German observers who had been thoroughly indoctrinated in Nazi racial ideology. African-American soldiers drove jeeps, performed maintenance on them, supervised motor pools, and demonstrated technical competence equal to white soldiers. This directly contradicted the racial theories that formed a fundamental pillar of National Socialist ideology. Feldwebel Kurt Wagner recorded his observations with the bewilderment of a man whose worldview was being systematically dismantled by empirical evidence. Negro soldiers, he wrote, using the terminology of his time and culture, operate and repair these vehicles with the same apparent efficiency as white soldiers. Our racial theories explicitly state that this should be impossible, that such people lack the intelligence and discipline for complex technical work. Yet the evidence before my eyes is undeniable. Either our theories are incorrect, or the Americans have discovered methods of training that overcome natural limitations, or I am fundamentally misunderstanding what I am observing. None of these possibilities is comfortable to contemplate. American modifications to their jeeps demonstrated an organizational flexibility that German military culture, with its emphasis on standardization and following established procedures, could not easily accommodate. Within days of landing in Normandy, combat units were making field modifications to their vehicles based on observed needs and local conditions. Soldiers welded additional armor plate to protect drivers from small arms fire and shrapnel. They installed improvised wire cutters on front bumpers to counter German piano wire traps strung across roads at neck height, designed to decapitate the unwary. They mounted multiple machine guns for additional firepower, transforming reconnaissance vehicles into mobile gun platforms. Medical units converted jeeps to improvised ambulances by welding stretcher racks to the rear cargo areas. Signal units loaded jeeps with radio equipment, creating mobile communications centers. Engineers mounted mine detectors and carried specialized equipment. Each modification was crude and improvised by German standards, often accomplished with whatever materials were available, but immediately effective in solving specific tactical problems. The contrast with German equipment maintenance procedures became increasingly stark as the campaign progressed through June and into July. Wehrmacht vehicles required specific fuel grades, with gasoline engines demanding higher octane fuel than was often available. They required specialized spare parts manufactured to precise specifications, and these parts competed for limited production capacity with weapons, ammunition, and other essential war materials. They required trained mechanics who understood the specific quirks and requirements of each vehicle type, and these specialists were increasingly scarce as casualties mounted and training programs struggled to produce replacements. Many German units, particularly infantry divisions, still relied heavily on horse-drawn transport for artillery and supply, with each division requiring thousands of horses that consumed tons of fodder daily. The horses were vulnerable to artillery fire and air attack, required constant veterinary care, and limited mobility to walking pace. Watching American units advance at 30 miles per hour in vehicles that required only gasoline and basic maintenance was profoundly demoralizing for soldiers trudging alongside horse-drawn wagons. By June 15th, German military intelligence estimated that American forces in Normandy possessed over 4,000 jeeps alone, with hundreds more arriving with each tide. This number seemed impossible to officers who could remember the entire German army invading Poland with fewer than 3,000 motor vehicles of all types. The mathematics of American production, when German intelligence officers finally began to grasp its true scale, suggested something even more disturbing. The United States could lose every single vehicle currently in Normandy and replace them all within 2 weeks using only a fraction of their total production capacity. This was not warfare as Europeans understood it. This was industrial mass production applied to military operations, and no amount of tactical brilliance or individual heroism could overcome such material disparity. Colonel Ernst Wagner of the Panzer Lehr Division, another elite German formation that had been committed to the Normandy fighting, compiled an extensive intelligence report based on prisoner interrogations, captured documents, and direct observation of American operations. His report, which reached Field Marshal Rommel's headquarters shortly before Rommel was wounded in an air attack, painted a devastating picture. "We face an enemy," Wagner wrote, "who has industrialized warfare to a degree we never imagined possible, much less achieved ourselves. They manufacture military vehicles using the same assembly line methods they developed for producing civilian automobiles before the war. Every American soldier, or nearly everyone, seems to know how to drive and perform basic vehicle maintenance, suggesting a society thoroughly familiar with automotive technology. Their entire society appears to be mobilized for mechanized warfare in a way that ours, despite all our efforts and sacrifices, never achieved. We designed an army to fight the last war with incremental improvements. They designed an army to fight a completely new kind of war based on industrial mass production and universal motorization. The fundamental disparity in production philosophy proved unbridgeable, a gap too wide for tactical skill or strategic genius to overcome. German vehicles like the Kübelwagen were well-engineered machines, carefully constructed by skilled workers and designed for long service life with proper maintenance. They reflected the German industrial tradition of quality craftsmanship and precision manufacturing. But even at peak production, with factories operating at maximum capacity, Germany could produce only a few dozen Kübelwagens per day. American Jeeps were simple, crude by German engineering standards, built to adequate rather than excellent specifications, designed for replacement rather than longevity. but they rolled off assembly lines at rates that Germany could not match even if it devoted all its automotive production capacity solely to military vehicles. Where German industry sought perfection in each individual vehicle, American industry sought adequacy multiplied by overwhelming numbers. Where German factories employed craftsmen to hand-fit components, American factories used assembly line techniques to install interchangeable parts. The comparison was between artisan production and industrial mass production, and in total war, mass production was proving decisively superior. General der Panzertruppen Fritz Bayerlein commanded the Panzerlehr Division, generally considered one of the most capable German armoured formations. His assessment, provided in a report to higher headquarters, demonstrated a clear-eyed understanding of the strategic situation. "We are fighting the last war," he wrote, "while the Americans are fighting the next one. We perfect individual vehicles to the highest possible standard while they perfect the industrial system that produces adequate vehicles in overwhelming quantities. We train specialist mechanics who understand every detail of complex machinery, while they design vehicles simple enough that any soldier can maintain them with basic training. We are artisans fighting against an assembly line, skilled craftsmen competing with mass production, and the assembly line is winning because quantity has a quality all its own. No amount of tactical excellence can overcome such material disparity when it reaches this scale. The American system's built-in redundancy frustrated every German attempt at tactical disruption. Destroying a bridge to halt American supply columns proved futile when combat engineer units appeared within hours, carrying portable bridging equipment, often transported on jeeps. These engineers would construct temporary bridges capable of supporting heavy traffic in a matter of hours, bypassing the destroyed structure and maintaining the flow of supplies. Ambushing reconnaissance patrols achieved little lasting effect when identical replacement vehicles and fresh crews appeared within hours to continue the mission. Mining roads, a traditional method of disrupting enemy movement, only caused the Americans to drive through adjacent fields, their four-wheel drive vehicles treating obstacles as minor inconveniences rather than impassable barriers. Every German tactical success, every bridge destroyed, every ambush executed, every mine successfully planted, was negated within hours or days by American material abundance and organizational efficiency. The Jeep gradually became a symbol of this abundance that transcended its purely military function. German soldiers reported seeing these vehicles used for tasks that would have been considered criminal waste in the Wehrmacht. Delivering mail to forward units, a task German soldiers accomplished on foot or through irregular transport when available. Transporting war correspondents and journalists to observation positions, dedicating valuable military equipment to propaganda purposes. Carrying chaplains to forward positions to conduct religious services. Treating spiritual morale as worth dedicating transport assets. Even moving generals' personal baggage and equipment, a use of military resources that would have resulted in severe disciplinary action in the German army. This casual use of military equipment for convenience and comfort rather than strict operational necessity demonstrated a material wealth that German soldiers, raised in a culture of scarcity and taught to conserve every resource carefully, found both amazing and deeply demoralizing. Lieutenant Friedrich Hoffmann, commanding a platoon of the 716th Infantry Division, wrote regular letters to his family when military postal service permitted. His letter of June 18th provides insight into the psychological impact of American material abundance. "The Americans," he wrote, "use their military vehicles the way we might use bicycles, casually and for any purpose without concern for wear or fuel consumption. Yesterday I observed through field glasses a single jeep being used to deliver hot food to an isolated outpost, a trip that wore the vehicle's engine and consumed precious fuel for no purpose other than the comfort of 3 men who could easily have eaten cold rations or walked back to the field kitchen. In our army, those soldiers would walk several kilometers and eat whatever food they carried, and no one would consider dedicating a vehicle to such a trivial task. This American wastefulness should be a military weakness, a failure of discipline and resource management, but when you can waste without consequence because you have unlimited resources, then wastefulness itself becomes a kind of strength. They are teaching us that abundance changes the fundamental rules of warfare. The technological gap between American and German logistics appeared in unexpected details that accumulated into overwhelming systemic advantage. American Jeeps came from the factory equipped with standardized toolkits, carefully designed to include every tool needed for field maintenance. They included comprehensive maintenance manuals printed on waterproof paper, written in clear language that assumed no specialized knowledge, illustrated with detailed diagrams showing every component and procedure. They carried spare parts packages calculated by statistical analysis of component failure rates, ensuring that the parts most likely to need replacement were immediately available. German vehicles often lacked even basic tools, forcing mechanics to improvise with whatever implements they could obtain. German maintenance procedures relied primarily on the mechanic's experience and training rather than comprehensive documentation, which meant that repairs required skilled specialists rather than soldiers with basic training. German spare parts competed for space in an overstrained logistics system that prioritized ammunition and fuel, and obtaining replacement components often required navigating a complex requisition system that could take weeks even when the parts were available. As June gave way to July and the Allied breakout from Normandy approached, German forces found themselves increasingly unable to compete with American operational mobility. Static defensive positions, carefully prepared with fields of fire and mutual support, were simply bypassed by jeep-mounted reconnaissance units that found gaps in the German lines and reported them to higher headquarters. Artillery positions, traditionally safe behind the front lines, found themselves overrun by rapidly advancing motorized infantry that appeared before the guns could be displaced to new positions. Supply lines were cut by fast-moving American patrols that penetrated behind German positions, struck suddenly against vulnerable targets, and then disappeared before German reserves could respond. The battlefield had become fluid and dynamic in ways that decisively favored the side with unlimited motorization and the fuel to sustain continuous operations. Major Wilhelm von Steuben, serving on the staff of the German 7th Army, spent late July observing American preparations for Operation Cobra, the breakout offensive that would shatter German positions in Normandy. His assessment, written in a private journal that survived the war, demonstrates remarkable clarity about the strategic situation. "The Americans have achieved something we believed impossible," he wrote, "the complete and total motorization of an entire field army. Every soldier can be moved by vehicle rather than marching on foot. Every artillery piece can be towed at highway speeds rather than moved by horse-drawn transport. Every supply item can be delivered directly to the unit that needs it rather than being transferred through multiple intermediate depots. They have eliminated the logistical friction that has limited military operations throughout history. We are fighting a 19th century war, relying on methods and organizations that would be recognizable to Napoleon's marshals, against an enemy waging a 20th century war based on industrial mass production and universal mechanization. The outcome is inevitable. The German High Command's various attempts to counter American motorization and material superiority proved consistently futile. Orders to target concentrations of vehicles were meaningless when vehicles were distributed everywhere throughout the American operational area. Efforts to interdict American supply lines through artillery fire and air attack failed because the Americans had built redundancy into every aspect of their logistics system, with multiple routes, distributed supply dumps, and excess capacity that could absorb substantial losses without disrupting operations. Plans to exploit American dependence on petroleum fuel by targeting storage facilities were negated by a supply system that delivered gasoline in quantities that Germany had not seen since the early campaigns of 1940. American fuel trucks seemed as numerous as combat vehicles, and fuel dumps were scattered so widely that destroying any one of them had negligible impact. By the time Operation Cobra launched in late July, American forces in Normandy possessed over 15,000 vehicles of all types, with jeeps still comprising the single largest category. German intelligence, compiling estimates from prisoner interrogations, aerial reconnaissance photographs, and signal intercepts, calculated that the Americans could suffer 50% vehicle losses and still remain more completely motorized than any German division at full authorized strength. This calculation, when reported through channels to Berlin, was dismissed by higher headquarters as defeatist pessimism. In fact, the estimate was conservative. American production capacity and the supply pipeline across the Atlantic meant that vehicle losses were being replaced faster than they occurred, and the total number of vehicles in theatre was increasing daily despite combat losses and mechanical failures. The long-term influence of American motorization extended far beyond immediate military impact in Normandy. German officers who survived the war and returned to civilian life carried these lessons with them into the reconstruction of post-war Germany. The American model of standardization, mass production, and design for manufacturability rather than perfection would influence German industrial development during the economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s. The Volkswagen automobile, which had failed utterly as the Kübelwagen to compete with the American Jeep during the war, would succeed spectacularly as the civilian Beetle in peacetime by applying the mass production principles the Americans had demonstrated so devastatingly in Normandy. The contrast was instructive. The Kübelwagen, well engineered and carefully built, could not be produced in sufficient quantities to meet military needs. The Beetle, designed for simple mass production and ease of maintenance, became one of the most successful automobiles in history. Feldwebel Otto Schulz was captured during the Falaise pocket fighting and spent 3 years as a prisoner of war in the United States, much of that time working in American factories as part of a labor program. His post-war reflections, recorded in a memoir published decades after the war, provide valuable perspective on what German soldiers learned in Normandy. In Normandy we learned, he wrote, that modern industrial war is not primarily about courage, tactical skill, or even strategic brilliance, but about industrial capacity and organizational efficiency. The Americans showed us that victory in total war belongs to whoever can produce the most weapons and equipment, ship them across oceans most efficiently, distribute them most effectively, and replace losses most rapidly. The Jeep was not merely a military vehicle, but a physical symbol of a completely new kind of warfare that we were neither prepared to fight nor capable of matching. Every Jeep we saw represented not just one vehicle, but the entire industrial system that produced it. And that system was larger and more efficient than anything Germany could create. The story of German forces encountering American mass motorization in Normandy represents far more than a simple military mismatch or disparity in equipment. It was a fundamental collision between two entirely different civilizations and their approaches to warfare, technology, and industrial organization. The Germans, with their deep tradition of professional military excellence cultivated over centuries, their respect for craftsmanship and precision engineering, their emphasis on carefully maintaining expensive equipment, met an American military that had transformed warfare from an art practiced by professionals into an industrial process managed through mass production and statistical analysis. German soldiers had been trained to be warriors, to value courage and skill and tactical excellence. They found themselves competing against an opponent who valued production efficiency and logistics management and supply chain optimization. The endless columns of jeeps that poured across the Norman countryside during that summer of 1944 represented something far more profound than simple military vehicles or transport equipment. They were the physical manifestation of what President Roosevelt had called the arsenal of democracy, tangible proof that American industrial might could be projected across oceans, delivered to battlefields in quantities that rendered traditional military calculations obsolete and sustained indefinitely regardless of losses. For German soldiers watching those columns advance, each individual jeep carried the same devastating message. The age of warfare as a contest between armies of professional soldiers had ended. The age of warfare as a contest between industrial systems and production capacities had begun, and in that contest, Germany had already lost. The final assessment belongs to Hauptmann Ernst Bergmann, who observed American operations throughout the entire Normandy campaign from June through August, survived the chaotic retreat through France, and eventually returned to Germany, where he became an automotive engineer during the post-war reconstruction. Writing in his memoirs decades after the war, with the perspective that time and experience provided, he offered this conclusion. The Americans taught us in Normandy that in modern total war, the factory is ultimately more important than the battlefield itself. The battle is decided not by the courage of soldiers or the brilliance of generals, but by the productivity of industry and the efficiency of logistics. Their jeeps, arriving in endless numbers throughout the campaign, each one absolutely identical to all the others and immediately replaceable if destroyed, showed us that warfare had fundamentally become a branch of industrial production rather than a military art. We thought we were soldiers fighting for our country. They showed us we were simply workers in a factory of destruction, and their factory of destruction was infinitely larger, more modern, more efficient, and more productive than ours could ever be. That was the real lesson of Normandy, learned vehicle by vehicle, day by day, through the summer of 1944.